Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm looking at the first 32-inch 4K OLED gaming monitor to use an RGB striped subpixel layout, the Asus ROG Swift PG32UCWM. This bad boy is using a brand new tandem WOLED panel from LG Display, and it offers quite a unique range of features and performance compared to existing OLEDs on the market. This isn't your typical WOLED. The switch to a new RGB subpixel layout fundamentally alters how the OLED panel functions in terms of brightness and colors. The baseline specs here include a 32-inch screen size, 3840 by 2160 resolution at up to 240Hz, and a glossy coating that Asus brands True Black Glossy. There's also dual mode support, pushing the refresh rate up to 480Hz at 1080p. DisplayPort 2.1 is included here, as is adaptive sync support, and we get Display HDR True Black 400 certification. Now, if you saw those specifications listed on a product page, you'd probably be wondering what the big deal is. 32-inch 4K 240Hz OLEDs have been available for several years now, including glossy WOLED options and, of course, QD-OLEDs. But this is the start of a new panel generation, as LG Display looks to overhaul their WOLED lineup, splitting their tandem WOLED options into panels with the older RGWB subpixel layout and panels with the new RGB stripe layout. Asus are actually going to offer both of these panel variants in 2026 ROG monitors, but today we're looking at the highest end RGB stripe model. So what's the big deal with RGB stripe, and what does this even mean? Well, to display every color, modern monitors split each pixel into multiple subpixel components. Historically, displays have used red, green, and blue subpixels in a left to right striped layout, ultimately creating a square pixel. This is what you'll find in the vast majority of LCD monitors, which have been the dominant display type over the last couple of decades. With the RGB stripe being ubiquitous, clever engineers found ways to use this to enhance the visual experience through something known as subpixel rendering. If you know the layout of the subpixels, you can perform subtle changes to improve image quality and anti-alias edges. On a 1080p monitor, for example, there's only 2 million pixels to work with, but 6 million subpixels. Fully harnessing those subpixels increases the effective resolution of the display. In particular, subpixel rendering was used to improve text quality through a system known as subpixel font rendering. You might have heard of Microsoft's ClearType that was introduced in the year 2000. This is a subpixel font rendering technology. When OLED monitors hit the scene, they first used subpixel layouts that weren't an RGB stripe. QD-OLED debuted with what I dubbed the triangle RGB layout, with green on top and red and blue beneath. WOLED integrated a white subpixel into the mix, adding a fourth element to each pixel. As neither of these layouts is an RGB stripe, OLEDs ended up being incompatible with the subpixel rendering systems that had been built around this layout for years. This meant that relative to an LCD using an RGB stripe, OLEDs typically offered worse text quality despite having the same screen resolution. The move back to RGB stripe with this new WOLED panel corrects this issue and makes WOLED fully compatible with traditional subpixel rendering for the first time. The PG32UCWM has text quality identical to LCDs. It looks sharp, clear, and excellent. In fact, as most LCDs use a matte screen coating, this glossy WOLED actually looks sharper and better, as there's no coating grain slightly diffusing the text. 32-inch 4K paired with RGB stripe is a great format for text-heavy desktop apps, and with 140 ppi of pixel density, you shouldn't spot much text aliasing at common font sizes. The big question is whether switching to RGB stripe leads to a noticeable text quality improvement compared to triangle RGB QD-OLED and previous RGWB WOLED panels. I'd say that while this RGB stripe panel does look better, it's a subtle improvement. Compared to an RGWB panel of the same density, RGB stripe offers more consistent anti-aliasing and sharper edges. Compared to QD-OLED, the small amount of color fringing around text is eliminated, and edge quality is slightly better. But given all of these variants are displaying text on a panel with decent pixel density, there's a chance you won't notice the difference, especially if you aren't overly sensitive to artifacts or if your eyes, they aren't the best at resolving fine detail. RGB stripe is a good change and it does help a bit, but I think the impact will be more noticeable once we get this format on 1440p panels. To achieve an RGB stripe, LG Display removed the white subpixel they were using with all previous WOLEDs. Before you ask, yes, even though this panel does not have a white subpixel, it's still WOLED, as the W in WOLED refers to the white emissive layer, not the white subpixel. This white emissive layer is used for all the subpixels filtered into each color. Removing the white subpixel does have some drawbacks. On the RGWB panel, only one subpixel needs to be active to show white, whereas on the RGB stripe panel, all 3 subpixels need to activate to show white. This gives the RGWB panel an advantage showing white. It can either deliver higher brightness at the same power level, or it can run more efficiently than an RGB stripe panel at the same white brightness. We'll see the effects of this later in the review. The PG32UCWM uses LG Display's standard glossy coating that we've seen on previous glossy WOLED monitors, such as Asus's own XG32UCWMG from last year. In both cases, the coating is branded as True Black Glossy, and the reflectance characteristics of both are very similar. I think this is an excellent coating, and it's my favourite among the current crop of OLEDs, though it isn't going to be ideal for all use cases. The main strength to this glossy coating is that it preserves deep blacks in most environments, with no light diffusion across the surface and no raised blacks from ambient lighting. As it's a glossy coating, there's no coating grain either, so the image remains crystal clear. The main weakness is reflectivity. The surface has a mirror-like finish that can produce direct reflections. The layer structure does a decent job of minimizing these reflections, so they're not terribly distracting, but anything bright is quite visibly reflected, especially when viewing darker content. This typically makes glossy a better choice for viewing the screen in darker rooms or environments where you can control light sources to minimize reflections. In brighter rooms, you might prefer a screen with a matte coating, though right now this RGB stripe panel is not available with a matte coating. The most relevant OLED coating comparison is probably to the new 2026 4K QD-OLED panel, which includes a film from Samsung Display that is designed to reduce ambient light reflectivity. One of the big downsides to QD-OLED panels is that in brighter rooms, the panel reflects ambient light, which raises black levels. The latest 2026 panel used in the PG32UCWM3 features improvements in this area compared to the original 4K QD-OLED panels, but it still can't get close to the ambient light handling of glossy WOLED. The PG32UCWM simply looks blacker in bright rooms. QD-OLED is less reflective when it comes to direct mirror reflections though, so you're less likely to notice yourself being reflected in the screen as an example. Ultimately, both panels are best used in darker rooms, and there's trade-offs to each one. Are you going to be more annoyed by the raised black levels of QD-OLED, or the increase in mirror-like reflectance of WOLED? HDR Performance is once again one of the more interesting aspects to this brand new OLED monitor. All the fundamentals are here, of course: deep zero-level blacks and per pixel control, which leads to an effectively infinite contrast ratio. As OLEDs have individual control over each pixel, they can show bright pixels right next to dark pixels with perfect clarity and no zone bleed. Fundamentally, it's a great technology for HDR. The actual HDR performance you get depends on the mode you use, and this monitor doesn't perform like previous RGWB WOLEDs. The switch to an RGB stripe has fundamentally changed how this display operates. Brightness and color output is different, and this brings the PG32UCWM more in line with QD-OLEDs. There are several HDR configurations available here, but most fall into one of two categories. The first category is True Black Performance, which is best seen in the Display HDR 400 True Black mode. This mode has accurate EOTF tracking in most types of scene, meaning that when HDR content requests a certain level of brightness, the screen delivers that brightness, and it doesn't matter whether it's a bright scene or dark scene. This mode typically looks great and natural, but it has one major downside. Brightness is capped to just 450 nits, and in very bright content, that limit is further reduced by ABL. The second category is what I typically refer to as a boosted brightness mode. You'll see this, for example, in the console HDR mode with the adjustable HDR toggle enabled and brightness increased to 100. This mode removes the 450 nit brightness limitation and now allows content to push up to the true hardware limit of this panel, which is around 1000 nits. This significantly increases the brightness punch in dark scenes, which is where the panel is allowed to go all the way up to 1000 nits. However, this mode is not very accurate in dark scenes. Boosted brightness configurations raise EOTF tracking in dark scenes significantly, meaning that the image you're looking at is much brighter than it should be. This can affect the intended mood of scenes, as shadows get raised and you get less of that deep, rich black experience that OLEDs are known for. However, in this boosted brightness mode, bright scenes are more accurate and are generally displayed properly with only small amounts of panel dimming seen in very bright content. Crucially, the PG32UCWM does not have a mode which offers good performance in dark scenes while still allowing 1000 nits of peak brightness. Your only option to access the highest brightness is a boosted brightness configuration. Other OLEDs often have an accurate mode for dark scenes that I call the peak configuration, But on QD-OLEDs, this mode came with the trade-off of panel dimming, the reverse of raised brightness in dark scenes, where instead, brightness is roughly halved in bright scenes. With previous WOLED monitors, the non-RGB stripe models, we didn't really have to worry about panel dimming. They provided a configuration that didn't limit peak brightness and was pretty accurate in both bright and dark scenes, sometimes with minor issues. However, what I saw with the latest 39-inch Alienware WOLED that also used an RGB stripe is that in its peak mode, it does have panel dimming. Dell also offer a boosted brightness configuration on that monitor, which eliminates panel dimming at the cost of over-brightening in dark scenes, exactly what this Asus monitor offers when you set brightness to 100. I suspect what Asus have done with the PG32UCWM is only offer the boosted brightness configuration to avoid panel dimming. The Dell model offers 3 modes, falling into the categories of true black, peak, and boosted brightness. The Asus doesn't offer that peak mode. The only choice is true black with limited brightness or boosted brightness that is inaccurate in dark scenes. When an OLED panel has hardware limitations that mean panel dimming is inevitable, and this appears to be the case with RGB striped WOLEDs as well as QD-OLEDs, I think it's crucial to offer all 3 categories of HDR mode. This allows you to pick what type of experience you want, whether that's the best accuracy in dark scenes or in bright scenes. I think this compromise is necessary while we are still faced with the extreme annoyance of panel dimming. Ideally, of course, there would just be one mode that offers the full peak brightness of the panel and doesn't introduce panel dimming. It's also just really disappointing to see this regression in WOLED technology. One of the key selling points to WOLEDs previously was the lack of panel dimming compared to QD-OLEDs. And while this Asus model doesn't technically have panel dimming, it acts in the same way as a QD-OLED trying to cover up panel dimming by cranking the brightness. That's a lot of information to take in about various HDR modes, but I think it's important to describe how this monitor acts in HDR content. It still looks fine enough in a lot of scenes. The boosted brightness mode doesn't look terrible. It's just not displaying content as intended in certain situations. And the mode that does display content as intended has a very low brightness ceiling. I personally prefer to use an OLED in the peak mode over the boosted brightness mode, as I think panel dimming looks better than over-brightening in dark scenes. So to me, this monitor doesn't offer the best HDR modes, but others may find the included options are just fine, especially if you like bright daytime content. Here's our comparison chart showing accuracy in dark scenes. The true black mode is very accurate, that's at the top of this chart, but then you'll find the console HDR mode with brightness 100 way down the bottom, along with other boosted brightness modes like the AW3926QW Peak 1300 Bright mode. Standard peak modes are much more accurate, like the Peak 1000 nit setting on the 322URX. In bright scenes, both the true black and console HDR configurations offer a similar experience, which has mid-table accuracy. On other monitors with panel dimming, you see a big gulf between the true black and peak modes here, for example, what we find with the 322URX. We also see a performance regression compared to the WOLED-based XG32UCWMG, which is pretty good in dark scenes and excellent in bright scenes in the same mode. Color accuracy is pretty good in both configurations though. For this test, I've shifted to using color match without the luminance error, so we can isolate just the color performance as opposed to any brightness inaccuracies. The PG32UCWM is pretty accurate here, all things considered, though not as good as the PG32UCDM3. In synthetic brightness tests, full screen brightness is disappointing at just 230 nits, which is lower than what the panel achieves in SDR content. Not quite sure why that's the case. This is slightly behind first-gen QD-OLEDs and well behind the 2026 models, which achieve over 300 nits. 10% window brightness is just over 500 nits, matching the 2026 QD-OLED panels and exceeding the earlier 2024 models. However, this is a brightness regression compared to the XG32UCWMG and PG32UCDP, which hit over 700 nits with help from the white subpixel. At a 2% window, we see peak brightness fall just short of 1000 nits, achieving 985 nits on my panel. This is roughly in line with both 2024 and 2026 4K QD-OLED panels, which cap out at 1000 nits. However, past WOLEDs quite easily pushed up into the 1200 nit range, so again, this is a brightness regression, and the PG32UCWM doesn't get as bright as the Alienware 39-inch ultrawide that uses similar technology. In terms of brightness versus window size, the PG32UCWM typically tracks slightly below the 2024 QD-OLED panel seen in the MSI 322URX. The newer 2026 panel in the PG32UCDM3 pulls ahead, especially at larger window sizes, while the previous gen WOLED panel in the XG32 model has similar brightness at large windows, but pulls ahead for peak brightness. In real scene content, the PG32UCWM is a little disappointing in its brightest configuration. This display doesn't get as bright on average as 2024 QD-OLEDs, offering a geo mean of 428 nits versus 472 nits on the 322URX. This is partially because brightness boosting can actually hurt brightness results in some of these tests, raising the overall scene APL, which reduces the peak brightness capacity of the panel in that scene. This clearly happens in both of the scene ones, which have higher peak brightness on the QD-OLED. We also see slightly lower brightness than the non-tandem RGWB model, the XG32UCWMG. The XG model has no panel dimming and can achieve higher brightness in some mid-APL content. These results are basically as expected given the brightness versus window size results, as overall this panel, well, it isn't really capable of the same level of brightness. The most disappointing results are when comparing the UCWM to the UCDM3. The latest 2026 QD-OLED, which competes in the same price class, is quite a bit brighter on average. I saw a 21% higher average across these 8 scenes, with better peak performance in some content and a higher output in high APL scenes. It's not a massive difference, but the brightness characteristics of the newer QD-OLED panel is superior, with this RGB stripe WOLED only really reaching the output of those first generation 4K units. It's probably also worth exploring color space coverage, which is 99% DCI-P3 and 76% Rec 2020. This is an increase in color space compared to non-tandem WOLED, but it's not quite as high as tandem WOLED with the RGWB subpixel layout, and it's slightly behind QD-OLED as well, but not to a huge degree. In terms of HDR color volume, the PG32UCWM is able to put up good numbers, but I wasn't blown away. Volume is up 15% compared to the XG32UCWMG, but this is partially due to the XG model having higher overall brightness, and it sits 13% behind QD-OLED. In terms of color brightness, the PG32UCWM is able to deliver significantly higher color brightness than WOLEDs with the white subpixel though, getting into the range of QD-OLEDs. If we think about this in terms of a white level equivalent, RGWB models deliver color brightness in line with what you'd expect from a panel that can only achieve about 500 nits of white brightness, whereas the RGB stripe model delivers color brightness in line with a 1000 nit panel. Effectively, to achieve such high white brightness figures, RGWB models are only boosting white brightness through the white subpixel, whereas this Asus model is more even in its brightness output between white and colors. The PG32UCWM supports Dolby Vision. It's disabled by default, but can be enabled through the HDR format option in the OSD. Asus give you 3 Dolby Vision options, bright, dark, and gaming, but all of them are limited to around 450 nits and offer performance most similar to the HDR10 True Black mode. When hooked up to a Windows PC, the way Dolby Vision works is that the monitor runs in the Dolby Vision mode most of the time, switching into the HDR10 mode when HDR10 content is detected. The screen briefly flicks black to change modes. A decent amount of the time this works well. The monitor flicks over to use the HDR10 mode in a number of games, allowing you to benefit from the brighter HDR10 options like console HDR. However, some of the time HDR10 is not detected properly, so the monitor remains in the Dolby Vision mode, and this happens when watching HDR YouTube videos in Chrome, for example. On Windows, I'd generally recommend leaving Dolby Vision disabled. Very few games support Dolby Vision on PC, none of which have been released recently. Some streaming services might use Dolby Vision for playback, but at least for gaming, it's best to just keep the monitor in the HDR10 mode to avoid mode switching or accidentally running in the wrong mode. Dolby Vision is much more useful if you plan on hooking up the display to other sources. A lot of media players have great support for Dolby Vision and will play back Dolby Vision content through streaming apps, though this will be done with limited brightness, so even then you might want to force HDR10. The Xbox Series X also supports Dolby Vision gaming if you happen to own one. I'm not going to discuss motion performance for too long in this review because the PG32UCWM offers the same motion experience as previous 32-inch 4K 240Hz WOLEDs. This is because response time performance is effectively identical across different gaming OLEDs, and the refresh rate is unchanged compared to the first generation of panels. It's also the same refresh rate at 4K as you get on flagship 2026 QD-OLED models, so there's not much to discuss comparatively. The refresh rate essentially dictates the motion clarity you get with an OLED monitor. Higher refresh rate models deliver better clarity when the highest refresh rate is used. But if you operate two different OLEDs at the same refresh rate, motion clarity will be identical regardless of what the maximum refresh rate actually is. So, for example, if you are running a game at 120 FPS/120 Hz, motion clarity would be the same on both a 240Hz OLED and a 165Hz OLED. It's only when running games above 165 FPS do the 240Hz models have an advantage in clarity and smoothness. That's important to note if you were tossing up between a high-end 240Hz model and one of the much cheaper 165Hz 32-inch 4K OLEDs that are available these days. A 240Hz refresh rate is still very sufficient for a 4K monitor in 2026. It offers a great level of smoothness and responsiveness for desktop apps and tons of headroom for all types of gaming. If you like to use frame generation, a 240Hz refresh rate enables a base render rate of 120 FPS in the 2x mode, which is still a nice low latency experience, or an 80 FPS base render rate in the 3x mode. For competitive gamers, the PG32UCWM offers dual mode, which increases the refresh rate to 480Hz but drops the resolution to 1080p. If you're playing a game at a high frame rate like 480 FPS, the 480Hz mode provides a genuine clarity improvement in fast-paced titles, and it reduces input latency as well. Because OLEDs are so fast in general, dual mode tends to work really well in terms of improving motion clarity. I'd only recommend this mode for fast competitive games though. A 1080p resolution on a 32-inch screen is not great for text quality and sharpness. I'd describe the mode as relatively blurry, but it's not overly noticeable when playing games like Counter-Strike 2 or Apex Legends, and in most cases the UI in these games is still highly readable. The PG32UCWM does not use integer scaling. One 1080p pixel is typically made up of 4 primary native pixels with up to 4 additional pixels dimly activated. This type of scaling is pretty close to integer scaling, so it looks okay, and I should remind you that a native 4K panel can never look like a native 1080p panel due to an inherent subpixel layout difference at the hardware level. Asus's dual mode implementation is pretty straightforward. You enable it via the frame rate boost option in the OSD. When switching into this mode, the only thing that changes is the refresh rate and resolution. It otherwise performs exactly the same as the 4K mode, so the same HDR support, color performance, processing delay, and VRR support. Asus offer screen size emulation modes for 27 inches and 24.5 inches, but this further reduces the resolution to maintain the same type of scaling. The 24.5 inch mode runs at 1472 by 828, for example. The PG32UCWM supports ELMB black frame insertion. This mode attempts to increase the clarity of gaming at lower refresh rates by displaying every second frame as black. In the 4K mode, ELMB works at 120Hz to improve 120 FPS gaming up to the clarity of 240Hz. In the 1080p mode, ELMB boosts 240Hz gaming up to 480Hz, and it also works at 120Hz, improving clarity up to 240Hz like the 4K mode. This is a neat feature, but it's highly restrictive. To enable ELMB, you must disable variable refresh rates, HDR, and uniform brightness. Only the aforementioned refresh rates are supported, and you have to run games at a locked frame rate for it to work properly. So for example, you must run at exactly 120 FPS all of the time for 120Hz ELMB to look correct. The clarity boost is not as good as backlight strobing tech on the best LCD, so it's not something I would personally use for gaming, though it's a nice bonus feature. There's also an anti-flicker setting. It's a simple toggle on this monitor, raising the minimum refresh rate in the VRR mode from 48Hz to 140Hz. I wouldn't generally recommend using this option as it disables low frame rate compensation. What this means is that when your frame rate drops below 140 FPS, variable refresh is effectively disabled, and you may see tearing or juddering. If the frame rate drops further, below 120 FPS, variable refresh is enabled again. This narrow window where VRR doesn't work creates a jarring difference in smoothness as your frame rate enters and exits this zone, which isn't a good experience. Where it might be useful is in selective situations where you see flicker and where your overall frame rate will never enter the 120 to 140 FPS range where VRR doesn't work. On WOLEDs, VRR flicker is caused by gamma shifts at different refresh rates, as gamma is tied to refresh, even on this new panel. When the refresh rate fluctuates wildly, you'll see rapid gamma shifts, and this looks like flicker. In my experience testing situations where I saw flicker, the anti-flicker mode can reduce but not fully eliminate OLED VRR flicker. The easiest way to combat VRR flicker in general is to eliminate massive refresh rate fluctuations. It isn't pleasant to game when there are huge frame rate swings, so you'll probably want to stop that happening anyway, and that's why in most gaming scenarios with relatively stable frame rates, VRR flicker is not a big issue on OLEDs. However, there are games where the frame rate jumps all over the place in loading screens or menus, and there are also titles that have atrocious frame rate stability or stuttering, and this is where you may see flicker on the screen. Input latency is excellent, offering a sub 1 millisecond processing delay in both the SDR and HDR modes. There is also no processing lag penalty from using the 480Hz mode, so the 480Hz mode has better input latency overall. Combined with fast response times and a decent refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use. Let's take a look at SDR Performance next, and the PG32UCWM has strong out-of-the-box grayscale accuracy. My unit shipped with an essentially perfect color temperature and great adherence to sRGB gamma, leading to a low delta E average. By default, the monitor does not use any gamut emulation, so SDR colors are expanded from the usual Rec 709 up to fill the full wide gamut of this display. This leads to some oversaturation, and you might notice skin tones are a bit redder and less natural in the SDR mode. Still, this display stacks up well in factory calibration using default settings in grayscale. Color checker performance is more mid-table, though similar to other displays, which operate in the same way. Now, normally with SDR configurations, there's a couple of ways to easily get better accuracy. However, this monitor currently does not work well with Windows 11 Auto Color Management. With this mode enabled, no color management is performed, and the display does not emulate sRGB, so I think there might be a metadata issue which I've relayed to Asus. However, not to worry, because the included sRGB mode is very good. It can be accessed through the display color space setting. Switching it over to sRGB will emulate the sRGB color space, and it still gives you access to all other settings. This configuration has great grayscale accuracy, similar to the out-of-the-box configuration. Saturation and color checker results are much improved though. A delta E ITP average of 3.7 in color check is great and indicative of a properly calibrated display. This monitor also stacks up well in the charts compared to similar products. Grayscale accuracy is great in the sRGB mode, as we've come to expect from ROG Swift products. We also see strong numbers in color checker, though it's less of a standout here. Overall, it's a good showing though, and it's easy to get this display into an accurate configuration for SDR without needing to resort to software profiles. SDR Brightness is standard from a WOLED monitor, though a little disappointing if you were expecting results more in line with 2026 panels. 265 nits full screen white is similar to the first generation of WOLEDs that did not use tandem WOLED technology and used the RGWB subpixel layout, and it's also quite similar to the first generation of 4K QD-OLEDs. However, newer versions of OLED technology have begun pushing SDR brightness to around the 300 nit level or above. That's what you get with the PG32UCDM3, for example, so in that sense the PG32UCWM is a bit underwhelming. I wouldn't be overly concerned though. We're only talking about a 12% difference, and in many use cases 250 nits is sufficient for desktop app usage. The PG32UCWM does not use a uniform brightness configuration by default, so changing window sizes will affect brightness. You can stop that from happening by enabling the uniform brightness setting in the OSD, which I recommend doing. Minimum brightness is excellent at 14 nits. Uniformity is a contentious issue with tandem WOLEDs due to a flaw known as grey banding. However, I'm happy to report that grey banding is not an issue on this monitor. The ugly vertical bands seen in dark grey content on the 1440p tandem WOLEDs are not seen on this RGB striped 4K panel in either the 240Hz or 480Hz configurations. This is very similar to what we saw on the Dell AW3926QW, and it's good to confirm that the higher refresh rate of this display doesn't reintroduce grey banding. As on other tandem WOLEDs, higher refresh rates can make this issue worse. The PG32UCWM doesn't quite reach the level of perfect grey uniformity. There's still a small faint amount of dirty screen effect viewing the darkest greys, but this WOLED gets the closest to a QD-OLED that I've seen in terms of grey uniformity results, and it's much more suitable for using desktop apps that have uniform dark grey backgrounds like a lot of productivity apps. In terms of white uniformity, the PG32UCWM is not as good as a QD-OLED, but still pretty good. QD-OLEDs have great edge-to-edge uniformity, while this RGB striped WOLED has some brightness fall-off around the edges. You'll also spot some slight color shifting at the edges, which is actually due to viewing angles, not panel uniformity. There's a slight color shift when viewing at off angles, and because you view the edges at a slight angle at a normal viewing distance, this creates a slight color shift at the edges. This WOLED panel still has better uniformity than most IPS LCD gaming monitors of this size though. Power consumption is quite interesting. Displaying a 200 nit full white image, the PG32UCWM is only slightly less efficient than the PG32UCDM3 that uses a 2026 QD-OLED. The RGB striped WOLED panel uses 7% more power. The removal of the white subpixel does increase power consumption, showing white though. This new model uses 45% more power than the XG32UCWMG that used a previous gen non-tandem panel with the white subpixel. While gaming, the difference between having a white subpixel and not having a white subpixel is much smaller, as game content almost always features a mixture of colours. The PG32UCWM uses slightly more power than the PG32UCDM3 and XG32UCWMG, but it's pretty much negligible here. Pretty standard port selection here. We have one DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20, two HDMI 2.1 48 gigabits per second ports, USB-C supporting DP alt mode and 90 watts of power delivery, plus a 3-port USB 5 gigabits per second hub. The display can be used at the full 10-bit 4K 240Hz over DisplayPort 2.1 without DSC or over HDMI 2.1 with DSC. It will also work just fine over DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, and there's an included KVM switch. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle behind the Asus logo. Asus include a lot of features. For gaming, there is an FPS counter, crosshairs, sniper mode, timer, shadow boosting, and aforementioned stuff like the anti-flicker mode and ELMB. There's also a range of color settings and modes, picture-in-picture options, DisplayPort and DSC settings, and the ability to update the monitor's firmware over USB. OLED panels are susceptible to permanent burn-in, so they're not a great choice for continual static content like using desktop apps for long periods. Asus offer the standard 3-year burn-in warranty with this monitor, so no change despite the shift to a new type of panel. We're also getting all the usual OLED care options, allowing you to disable the screensaver option, taskbar detection and logo detection. There's also the Asus Neo proximity sensor, a handy inclusion that I've covered before. The PG32UCWM uses basically the same design that Asus have been using for a long time now with their ROG Swift monitors. This includes the use of the 3-legged stand base with wide prongs that take up quite a lot of desk space. We hear quite a few complaints from users about this design, especially as other monitors have started to move to flatter square bases that don't take up as much desk space and are functional in that you can put objects on top of the base. Strangely, Asus continue to use this large base design on their premium ROG Swift line when the ROG Strix line has shifted to using better square bases. The rear of the monitor features the standard central box design, which is attached to the slim OLED panel assembly. This box uses some nice transparent elements that look kind of cool, similar to what Asus first used on the PG27AQ WP-W. On the right hand side is Asus's matrix LED lighting, and there's also a red LED that shines out at the bottom of the stand, projecting an Asus logo, which is pretty ridiculous. It's a very sturdy stand, not much wobble in it at all, and it supports height, tilt, and swivel adjustments. The maximum amount of height on offer is good, but you can't pivot the display into a 90-degree orientation. I also like the even bezels on the front with no obvious chin. The power supply is integrated into the display and uses GaN-FET technology, which Asus claims allows for a smaller power supply footprint, better power efficiency, and less waste heat output. Overall, the Asus ROG Swift PG32UCWM is a very interesting monitor. I feel like I sometimes say that a lot, but in this case we're looking at the first 32-inch 4K RGB striped WOLED gaming monitor, so it really is interesting. It doesn't perform like WOLEDs we've seen previously, so it offers a new set of capabilities and another alternative to QD-OLED. Now, there's a lot of things that the PG32UCWM does well. As it's a 32-inch 4K 240Hz OLED, it ticks a lot of boxes. Large screen size for immersive gaming or productivity work, a high resolution with great pixel density, a high 240Hz refresh rate for excellent motion clarity, and the deep blacks with per pixel control that is inherent to OLED technology. A lot of the time, this monitor does deliver great image quality. However, we're not looking at this monitor in a vacuum. There are lots of other 32-inch 4K OLEDs to choose from, so how does the PG32UCWM stack up? Well, firstly, this is a $1,300 US monitor, so it's very much a high-end flagship product with a very high price tag. At that price, this unit is directly competing with the latest 2026 QD-OLEDs, which typically start around $1,000 and go up from there. Asus's model using that panel, the ROG Swift PG32UCDM3, is the exact same price. Now, this new RGB striped WOLED does have some key advantages over 2026 QD-OLEDs. The glossy screen coating delivers deeper blacks in some environments, and generally, I think it looks better than the QD-OLED coating. The RGB striped subpixel layout provides a slight improvement to text quality versus QD-OLED triangle RGB, but it's not a major upgrade, and I suspect a lot of buyers won't notice the difference. Then there's dual mode support. The 1080p 480Hz mode delivers better motion clarity for competitive gaming, an option that isn't available on QD-OLEDs at all. But outside of these things, the QD-OLED panel actually performs better a lot of the time. The new 2026 panel with a True Black 500 rating has higher SDR brightness and higher HDR brightness. While the peak capabilities of the panel aren't that different, around 1000 nits for both, in most other conditions the QD-OLED outputs higher brightness. It also has a wider color gamut, better color volume, and better uniformity viewing both whites and dark grays. With previous WOLED panels, we used to be able to talk about a massive advantage that LG Display's technology had over QD-OLEDs, the lack of panel dimming. This meant HDR brightness output was much more consistent between dark and bright scenes within the one HDR mode. But this new panel doesn't seem to have this characteristic, and Asus seem to be masking it with a boosted brightness HDR configuration. This means their own competing PG32UCWM3 model actually has more HDR modes and better user choice over HDR performance. You can use the QD-OLED in a boosted brightness configuration, just like this WOLED if you want to, but that model also has the flexibility to show dark scenes with better accuracy, if you're okay with panel dimming in bright scenes. Ultimately, I think the 2026 QD-OLED is a better monitor at displaying HDR content. The PG32UCWM delivers performance that is much closer to the original wave of 32-inch 4K QD-OLEDs that hit the market in 2024, and 240Hz variants using that panel start around $800 US. I don't see a compelling reason to spend $500 more on the RGB stripe WOLED panel. In some ways, this WOLED panel is one step forward, two steps back. I think the fundamentals here are quite good. The RGB stripe allows for a massive increase in color brightness compared to RGB WOLEDs. There's benefits to text quality and dark gray uniformity. It's a great platform for the future of WOLED. But changing how the panel works so significantly has led to regressions in other areas. It looks like panel dimming is now an issue, and overall brightness is lower than past WOLEDs and current QD-OLEDs. I think there is a place in the market for the PG32UCWM and for RGB striped WOLED panels, but not at this price. $1,300 is far too high for what is being offered here. At a price point below $1,000, more in line with those 2024 QD-OLEDs, that's when I'd consider this panel. I'll add this one to our monitor.deals website and see whether it ever gets into that price range, but for now, if you're interested in a 32-inch 4K OLED, I'd go with a different option. So anyway, that's it for this extensive review of the PG32UCWM and the new RGB stripe 4K panel from LG Display. We also have the 27-inch version that we're going to be looking at soon. I expect it to perform very similarly to the 32-inch model, so hopefully that review won't be as long. But yeah, we'll be getting to that soon, so if you're interested more in the smaller format, stay tuned to Monitor's Unboxed for that. Also check out monitor.deals, links to those in the description below. We also have Patreon, a great way to support us and our independent testing. Links to buy these monitors are down in the description as well. Check that out if you're interested. But anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.